I know Steel Ball Run just came out recently as of the recording of this video a few days ago, or at least the teaser did. However, I still have some gripes about the previous parts, and in specific here, my second favorite part of all time, that being Golden Wind. Now, I think Golden Wind has a lot of good about it. A hell of a lot. I can talk about it all goddamn day. I like Giorno, I like Bruno's gang, I like Passion, I like the concept of, changing the status quo. I absolutely adore La Squadra, as I think till this day, they are single-handedly the best minor villain group of all time. I have a lot of good to say about Golden Wind. However, I have the biggest complaints about the part as well. And if you read the title of the video, my biggest complaint and the thing I want to change the most about it is that I think Diavolo is by far the single most wasted villain in all of JoJo's. Crazy, I know, but I really truly do believe that. However, I think a lot of you have, the justifiable question to ask me, why metas? Well, I think it's because Araki has a really bad habit of not establishing his villains. However, with Diavolo, he has a lot of problems on top of that. He feels underdeveloped because of that mystery. And there's a lot of elements to his character, that being, a mafioso boss, split personality, incredibly powerful stand user, a sloth-like nature that isn't very heavily used, that should have been a major focus on, that sadly was underutilized extremely, and in my opinion, I think should have been used a lot more to show the difference between him and Giorno, which ultimately would have led to a much more interesting group because of the mirror. So in this video, I want to do a little bit of a writing exercise to see if I could fix Diavolo and make him an overall better villain, with you guys being the judges of my course correction and changes to his villainy. So with that all being said, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. So before I get into any of the changes I'm going to do to Diavolo as a character, I'm going to set some ground rules for the entire video, because I feel like when people do these rewrites, they end up going into like fan OC territory, and I'm trying to avoid that. What I want to do in this video is not to add any new plot lines or OCs, completely get rid of them. That is the first major rule. The second major rule is to make it feel like Araki's writing. I don't want to change it so heavily that it doesn't feel like JoJo's. I still want to keep it in line with it and use other future villains and even past villains as examples to make Diavolo a better villain. The third rule being is I want to try to keep the ideas that are being used within the part / give more screen time to some of those core ideas / things we've already seen. The next rule will be I will try to keep it as original to the story as possible. I'm not going to try to divert it so much with all the minor additions that it feels like a completely new story. I still want to keep a lot of the same elements and beats of original Golden Wind, and specific the Golden Wind manga. And I won't be adding any stuff from the anime, because I do feel like to a certain degree the anime and manga versions of Golden Wind are a bit different. So I'm going to be in specific here more focusing on the manga. And of course, the major idea here that I really want to set in focus here is the idea of Diavolo's sloth-like nature. I'll expand more upon that as this video goes on, but I think it's one of the core tenets on why a lot of people actually like him, but without knowing why they actually like him. So with all that set up and rules out of the way, let's talk Diavolo. Now, in the beginning of the story, we're not going to change a lot of stuff here, but it's going to be a lot of minor stuff I do end up changing. Now, when Diavolo is introduced to the group in general, as a man just emailing the group. Now, we can work with this, in my opinion, the perfect setup to establish what kind of person Diavolo is. Now, this of course is going to use more like modern ideas of how emailing and texting work, so it might not be totally historically accurate at the time, but we'll use it for now. I want Diavolo, when emailing the group, to be more constant in emailing the group, be slightly more passive aggressive as time moves forward, as they get closer and closer to their destination. Now, adding upon that, he now emails the group a little bit more every event, more and more, just slightly. Now, I know this is a minor change, but in this change though, over time, he gets more aggressive. How so is, well, either when Fugo reads it or Bruno reads it, or anybody who reads it, it can be all of them at one point, doesn't really matter here, is that Diavolo gets more aggressive. in the manner of, what's taking you so long? Why are you causing all this damage when fighting La Squadra? Why haven't you dealt with La Squadra already? You should be faster about this. It's just constant texts of, hey, we're doing the job, we're getting to you at the best we can, but why are you constantly emailing so aggressively? Now, the group doesn't outright state this to them, but they probably make comments about this. And since this is a manga, instead of them just reading it off and, there's just like a panel of like, the email, crashed his PC or destroyed his PC in the manga, he will always be in that room that was presented when typing to them. So you're gonna see like a narrator bubble or him talking out loud or just a thought bubble of him reading it off. So you will always constantly see, before he is introduced to Trish, emailing the group, getting more and more aggressive. The reason why I want to add this is it adds kind of like this very weird, like, okay, the boss is always constantly in the background yelling and bitching and being mean. He is a boss, right? So, and at least in this sense, he's more like a corporate boss, being like, come on, we got to move the product, where's my thing, we got to hurry this up, yada yada yada, come on. It's kind of like that. In addition, he's always in the shadows. So quite literally and metaphorically, he will always be behind the group, being a shadow, never being shown in full here, just like when he destroyed his PC. The idea here is we are building the foundations of what Diavolo is. He is paranoid, he is aggressive, he is not a good boss, but of course he is a mafia boss, so this of course makes sense. So it will be a slow burn until he becomes the true villain. I think it's very minor, but in my opinion, it establishes him way more than it did before. Now, this is something I'm not going to change at all, that being the meeting with Bruno and Trish with Diavolo. I think actually here, this is a perfect showing of what Diavolo is. He is crazy, and it is totally obvious by this point in the story. The emails and the constant aggression over time leading to an eventual climax with the group eventually, delivering Trish. We've seen through this build up till this point, he has got more aggressive and he is totally fucking insane / evil. And the group kind of realizes that, but it's like, this is our boss. That is what's being established here. But when it comes to the main, core tenet of what happens here between, Bucciolati, Trish, and Diavolo, nothing changes here. I think it's a perfect example of what Diavolo should be. He is crazy. He is a mafia boss. He is here to get rid of anybody that knows his identity in their totality and remove them from the board. I think it's perfect. This is something I'm not going to change from what Araki originally established. I love this part of the story. Fantastic. Don't have a lot of criticism to change here. Good. However, this is probably going to be the first big change, or like the most dramatic change out of the entire story. So Bruno, of course, survives. The whole group leaves. Fugo is not a traitor in this version. He just ends up, leaving the group as per usual. And they, go off with Trish, and they're now going to, dethrone Diavolo as the gang leader and put Giorno in power. However, we are going to add a new scene / maybe basically a whole chapter dedicated to this, or maybe like a half and half where it's at the end of a chapter and then it continues on with the next chapter. Doesn't really matter here. What this scene is Diavolo personally interacting with the special squad. Now, this is where we're going to establish a lot of character here for Diavolo, and we're going to really get into the sloth-like nature and really deconstruct what Diavolo will eventually be at the end of the story, as this is kind of like the starting point to what Diavolo in his true character really is. So when Diavolo is giving out these orders personally to the special squad, a question is kind of asked here. It doesn't matter who ends up saying this, one of them does. I'm actually going to make it Carne because of course he doesn't get like any dialogue in the manga other than his stand attacking Bruno's group. So in this case, doesn't really matter, we'll use Carne, where Carne says something akin to, boss, why does it matter if your identity is revealed? You'll still be the head boss of all the Passion. No one's going to challenge you. You have a very powerful stand. Carne is basically glazing him here and says that this isn't really important. But then this next scene is what I feel like will establish what Diavolo is and truly wants. Just like his dialogue previously saying during his fight with Trish and Bruno about forever being in an everlasting climax, this is where it shows that he will forever want that no matter what. He wants to plateau at this climax for basically infinity, never leaving it. However, it is twisted here. Yes, Carne is entirely correct here in this scenario, or any of the other, special squad members who end up saying it, doesn't matter. Because of Diavolo's paranoia and split personality shows that he's not entirely fit to be the boss, but since he has so much power, nobody's actually going to challenge him. And he feels like if his face was ever shown, this would end up ruining it. However, like I previously said, or technically what Carne previously said, he is the mafia boss. He's paying off police officers. He has a massive amount of people under him. He has a massive amount of stand users under him, and himself being a pretty powerful stand user. King Crimson, shocker, is one of the stronger stands in the series because of Epitaph and actually because of King Crimson for the most part. So Carne is right here. No one's really going to challenge him if they actually know his face. He will be totally fine. But due to his paranoia and overall craziness, just him being him, it shows to the audience and basically to the special squad as well, Diavolo is, well, crazy. That is a logical idea that Diavolo is completely revoking here. And because of this, back sass or back talk, King Crimson eventually comes out, beats the shit out of Carne. By the way, during all of this, he's still in shadows. We do not know the actual identity of Diavolo at the current point in time yet. The whole purpose of this scene, in my opinion, is to show that Diavolo does not want change at all. This is supposed to be the status quo forever until he basically dies. This is an idea that is kind of represented in the story for I think a majority of it, but is never heavily emphasized. I think that is bad writing. I think this should be emphasized a lot more because it shows what Diavolo is in comparison to the other villains in JoJo. But we really don't get this with Diavolo. It's very minor in comparison to everybody else. So just with this scene alone, it establishes what he is and who he is. He is a sloth. Here's an announcement in between parts. I have a Patreon now on top of a channel membership where I will be posting exclusive content too. So if you're interested in me and what I want to do past YouTube, consider supporting. Thank you. Now, of course, we're going back to the original story here. So a few chapters later, eventually we get the interactions between Diavolo and Risotto and the death of Leon Abacchio. So this isn't going to change too dramatically here. In my personal opinion, Diavolo / technically Doppio versus Risotto is personally one of my favorite fights in the entire franchise. Having two villains go at each other is absolute cinema. I wouldn't change this fight at all up until the very end. We know that he wants an everlasting climax. He wants to basically kill anybody that knows his name or is trying to figure out what his face looks like, his name, etc., etc. He doesn't want his personal stuff out there. So, of course, in this moment, Diavolo is taking the necessary steps in order to ice people. His special squad is worrying about other parts and, of course, isn't doing the best job. So, of course, being a boss, you do it yourself to get rid of things. That's what a boss should do / what a mafia boss should do. I personally feel like Diavolo should have shown his face while he had King Crimson in full in Risotto's last moments. Why? A power move. Remember, Diavolo is a boss and has shown it before when he was fighting, of course, Polnareff. So in that moment, I kind of want to leave an air of mystery here where, Risotto kind of makes a comment, something akin to, I'm going to kind of voice act here. How did young, so old, dies, of course, and eventually, Aerosmith comes in, blasts him from behind as time skip activates. And with a scene like that, I think it adds, an air of mystery. Diavolo is not only young, but he's also old. So it's like, what is happening here? He doesn't look like Doppio. Up until this point, we have a crazy boss who is willing to, sacrifice others in order to do his bidding. Paranoid and crazy, will kill anybody who tries to figure out his face or identity just in general, and will personally go do it himself. In my opinion, this sounds really cool. I think it adds a lot to his character, much more than it originally did before, and is well established way before that. So in the death of Risotto, we get somebody way more threatening and way more looming over the main group in general. And shortly after that, of course, we get the death of Abacchio. Now this scene won't change too much. However, that weird hybridized state he was in during Risotto's fight attacks Abacchio, leaving even Abacchio confused as hell. How is he simultaneously young and old, small but big? It overall leads to a very confusing mess, and up until this point, we still don't know what he looks like. So, like Kira, He is now just this enigma. We don't know anything about him. All we know that this is Doppio, at least in the form that we currently know, and he somehow transforms. And he has a stand that has the ability to time skip or has some weird like time perception ability. And we know that he can look into the future and has the ability to control fate. But then he's also simultaneously in a old and young form, small and big form. It's overall a mess, but I think it's a good mess. I think this is a classic case in story writing where, because it's so messy and so like intriguing, it's like you want to figure out the mystery more and more, even more so than Kira, at least in my opinion. You want to stay engaged with it. Don't get me wrong, I think that still happens with the original Golden Wind manga, but in this case, it still keeps on going. In the death of Risotto and Abacchio here, it leads more into a mystery that I think a lot of people want to be engrossed in because it's so complex and so interesting. And especially coming from a main villain like this, I think even adds more to it. But of course, when we get into the main stuff that is Diavolo's backstory and the history of him and Polnareff, I'm going to change some things here as well. Now, it's going to be minor, but I think it's going to add a lot more substance and kind of remove the whole problem of Diavolo's mystery leads to missed opportunities, which that missed opportunity leads to an underdeveloped villain. So, what's going to change here? Not a lot. Basically, it almost stays exactly the same. I'm not changing Diavolo's backstory at all. However, I'm going to add or kind of improvise some scenes here. Of course, remember, this is a manga, so we have to use a little bit of visual storytelling. So once Diavolo's mom comes into his life, this is where Diavolo psychologically breaks. We see Diavolo's mother enter his life, and once that happens, you can maybe show a very small panel, maybe make it even major, where he breaks. And once he breaks, then we cut into where his father eventually is like, I'm gonna have to build him a garage because he's going all these places. And then he ends up discovering that his mother is underneath the concrete or the floorboard, which eventually ends up leading to his whole town being, burned alive, because of course Diavolo doesn't want anybody to know that he is, well, crazy, and then he committed this murder. That's all that I would change to his backstory, because I feel like in the original backstory, it was too vague. I'm okay with the mystery. I'm fine with that. But my problem is we don't know who Diavolo is, but due to all these minor additions I've given to him, we kind of know why he did that. He's just plain out crazy. We know that he had a psychological break and now he is basically two people. This should basically be pretty obvious at this point, but of course there is a little bit of JoJo shenanigans where of course he's both simultaneously, old and young, and that doesn't really make any sense, but of course, it's JoJo, so roll with it. But we know up until this point, and thanks to this backstory and eventually connecting the clues back, Diavolo, and the reason why he did this is, well, he's just fucking crazy. That's basically the sum of it. We are emphasizing his paranoia and weird tendencies and behaviors because of his traumatic, funny enough, backstory. That's it. Doesn't really make that overly complex. That's basically it. I think that's totally fine here in this scenario, and I think it's totally appropriate with Araki's writing style, because he really does do this a lot with more Pucci and Valentine, so adding this little addition shouldn't be too out of left field here. And at the end of the backstory, I would emphasize that this is the birth of the devil, the slothful guy who will always try to keep everything normal, or at least at that plateau. Now, this will be the most crazy addition. So this happens later on in his life, but I would add a scene where Diavolo interacts with Enya and Dio when he sells the stand arrows to them. Now, this wouldn't be too crazy, but I do kind of want, Dio to be more involved in the story in general. It feels really weird that we have a part in which we have, the son of Dio, but not a whole lot of Dio in it. Right? Kind of feels weird. So I feel like this is kind of needed. It doesn't have to be like a really dramatic scene. It really doesn't have to add a lot of character. A very minor addition. It doesn't have to be crazy. It could just be a very short 2-page or 3-page, conversation of them interacting. It wouldn't be like a crazy plot point, but I would think in retrospect, because he interacted with Dio, this would ultimately mean that later on in life, this is the reason why he fails, but at the current point leads to the birth of Passion. So after the backstory is explained in between, Dio and Diavolo and where that eventually leads, we eventually get Diavolo and Polnareff. Now, this stays the same for the most part, except I would also add something kind of akin to where Bruno and Diavolo talked, and Diavolo was talking about the everlasting climax and how his stand ability works. He would do the same here with Polnareff, kind of doubling down on the idea of he will forever want to be at that everlasting climax. He never wants to change from this point in his life. He always wants to be at that peak, not realizing that it's kind of stagnant and there really isn't anything really past this, because you always will be in the current same position you were always in. More on that later. Minor addition, but I think it kind of solidifies what his character has been for a very long time. And of course, after that, we end up having the modern interaction between Diavolo and Polnareff, and for the most part, with Diavolo and Doppio's interactions at the very end of the story, I think this is where I'd actually keep a lot of that mostly the same up until the acquiring of the arrow. Now, when it comes to the ending of Golden Wind, a lot of things are going to change here, but not at the start of the Colosseum stuff. That's probably going to be more towards the end. I think, the Death to Narancia stays the same, the body swap stays the same, the interaction between Diavolo and Polnareff stays the same. Nothing's changing there until they get close to Chariot Requiem. In this encounter, I'm going to make Diavolo win here. Why? Because I think he does everything correctly here. He makes the group get Trish closer to him. He fails in that regard, but to correct that, he uses the special group and his own services in order to get closer to Bruno and them to correctly kill them and whittle down their numbers, which was A, problem for Diavolo during their first encounter, and B, because they have now become dwindled, Diavolo can now gain the arrow and then kill all of them off. So ultimately, he gets a boon, a reward for all of his efforts in this moment, and potentially makes his climax even potentially higher. So that is pretty good for him. So for those reasons, that's why I say he should win here. Now, how he wins here is that Diavolo kind of sets himself up to where his body that is being controlled right now by Bucciolati is closer in proximity to Chariot Requiem. It's something I want to change for a specific scene to happen here. And in this encounter, Diavolo breaks the sun behind him in its totality, switching everybody's bodies. Of course, in this scenario, Giorno is still, in his own body, so he's the one who doesn't switch. But of course, for this scene to happen, he's a bit more farther away from Bruno, who's in Diavolo's body. He now is able to get the arrow from, Chariot Requiem's dissolving body. I was going to say burning, but I think it's technically dissolving here. From his dissolving body to gain the arrow. And well, Diavolo stabs himself with it. However, nothing happens at all. Why though? So the story I've been trying to construct here with Diavolo over the course of this video is that Diavolo is willing to do everything and anything in order to stay where he is at, to have an everlasting climax, to hit a peak, so to say, right? And to be at that peak forever. He is willing to destroy an entire village for that. He's willing to sell priceless artifacts in order to gain power. He's willing to sacrifice a lot of his own gang members and, of course, destroying the hierarchy of that gang in order to stay at the position that he is in. He sacrifices people in order to do that. He sacrifices his other half, at least in this scenario, and I would also technically say in the original story as well, in order to do that. He is willing to give up everything but himself in order to stay in the position that he is currently in. Why that is important is how stands work. Stands are a very complex system of powers that are within JoJo. So because of that, one of the major reasons how stands work, or one of the reasons how stands operate, is that they are mental energy. Now, I'm going to say this to you, but in universe, while Polnareff is seeing this happen and, Diavolo stabs himself and nothing happens, there's not even like a berserk stand like Chariot Requiem even appearing, is that Polnareff comes up with two answers to this question. Of course, the first one being is earlier within the fight, Polnareff comes up with the idea that he has been split into two people, that being Doppio and Diavolo. He doesn't know that exactly, but he feels like they are split up. Because of this personality split, because of this soul splitting, Diavolo doesn't actually have the proper mental energy, the potential in order to gain a upgraded stand like Yoshikage Kira, or a Requiem stand like him or Giorno. Even though Polnareff's body is completely weak and cannot handle the Requiem boost, his soul/mental power, right? The mental power that is able to manifest a stand can. But Diavolo doesn't have that. For a majority of his life has been that of complete stagnation at the peak. There is no will to move on forward. Even after gaining a Requiem stand, is what Diavolo's plan is, of course, in this scenario. Even after gaining that, really doesn't change anything. He just now has a greater power, but is still in the current position that he is still in. Unlike Giorno, who wants to completely change things, you know, constantly change with the environment, help people, make people's lives better, you know, not have anybody live his life or any of the lives that are currently happening due to drug addiction and stuff like that. In Kira's case, even though Kira is a villain, he was willing to be a family man in order to still, you know, fulfill his sexual desires and fantasy. He is still willing to change in order for his own goals and benefits. Diavolo doesn't want to do that. So he doesn't necessarily have the mental energy here. And you can say that's because of the split, or, you know, Polnareff can alternatively say, or the audience can also figure this out through, you know, a lot of, you know, thinking and planning and understanding how stands work, is that even if, you know, the potential, you know, soul splitting and, you know, splitting of the mind actually didn't do anything, that's what does him in. It's because Diavolo's personality has no more room to grow. He isn't worthy to be king of kings like Giorno. And so in that, Diavolo starts freaking out. He's like, I've done everything correctly. I sacrificed all these people. I was the boss. I was the mafia boss. I did all of this. And, you know, of course, he's freaking out. He's paranoid. We really see in this moment who Diavolo truly is. He is insane and evil and crazy. None of his plans were ever logical to begin with. It's kind of almost a very basic writing example here of, yeah, he was just insane to begin with. That's why he's evil. There's no like crazy dramatic plot. Of course there is, because, you know, he wants to be the mafia boss, but the origins of that evil are just simple. He's just insane. And in this moment he's just showing it off. He's throwing a hissy fit. He's going wild. He's like, why am I worthy? I should have done everything correctly. I'm more powerful than Polnareff, and all this extra, you know, garble and jargon to really try to like, save his ass, when in reality, it's not going to change anything. Even though he did everything correctly in the playbook itself, that being fate, if you want to start getting big brain here, was not going to allow him to win. He always cheated at life. He never actually wanted to make any meaningful progress. He's always been at a plateau. Sure, he's always said that he's always, you know, I want to be at this everlasting climax. Nothing is ever going to beat me. That has never been true. This is what that Carne scene was supposed to show at the beginning of this video. He isn't fit to be the king of kings. He's not fit to be at this everlasting climax. Nobody is. Nobody can always be at their peak. At one point, they will fall. It's bound to happen. But since Diavolo constantly abuses that, there's this two-sided coin of the universe, you know, wants its correct order and balance, because of course you're abusing fate and is going to get its due, and B, you're not worthy of the arrow to begin with. So, you know, you're not going to get what you want here. So in that moment of craziness and panic, you know, Giorno here uses his gold experience to eventually, you know, grab the arrow using vines or something, and he stabs himself. And I would say in this moment, he kind of has a reflection back to what Carne says, and he's like, oh, wait a minute, I still have King Crimson. I can still kill these guys for the most part. So he gains that confidence back. I want to say on his own without Trish's involvement. However, it doesn't mean anything, because eventually, you know, Giorno's actually worthy of the arrow. He stabs himself. And of course, from that moment onward, we get the death loop. But I feel like the death loop is even cooler in this scenario, because in and of itself, a death loop is complete stagnation. It is, in its entirety, the perfect sloth prison, I should say. You get what you want here. You're always in a state of constant stagnation. You can live for the rest of your life in a constant death loop. It's true in this regard to be ultimate poetic justice for what Diavolo wants and has done to people. I think it's ultimately perfect. Now, these are some things I would change for Diavolo, I think for the better. Now, I want you guys to critique me and criticize me on the things I've said here, if I did, you know, good or wrong on Diavolo's character. For the most part, I really do like this ending. Out of everything here, I think this ending is the best. Overall, you know, the slow, gradual build-up, the moments in between all this shot to really emphasize, you know, his weird personality shifts and changes, and his overall attitude to his, you know, his team, Passion in general, just the gang, how he interacts with Giorno and Bucciolati and Polnareff, etc., really add to his character, at least in my opinion here. I really think I did a pretty decent job here. I think it overall, at least to my opinion, really, you know, boosts his character rather than dissolves it here. I tried to just add minor additions and changes to really emphasize his current personality traits for the better. Now, do I think he's on like the levels of Poochie, Kira, or even Funny Valentine? No, but I do think he is better than some of the earlier villains that Araki has written here, just by adding some minor stuff. Now, with all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you for 100,000 subscribers. Did I say that right? That's an insane number. Thank you again. I will continue making these videos as long as you guys consider supporting me. I hope you like the face cam now. I'm going to try to, like, for analyzation videos and just kind of more opinionated videos, to do this. I won't do the power scaling ones, but I hope you do like the face cam. I'll try to insert it where I can and stuff, at least in post. So thank you. Stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.